Hello family, welcome to African Tales by Timmy. If you love powerful African stories filled with betrayal, redemption, and love, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this story with your friends and loved ones. Also, turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next tale. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy today's story.
The night air outside La Paloma glowed with the neon reflections of Victoria Island, a place where polished cars lined the streets and wealth hung thick like perfume. But inside the restaurant, beneath crystal chandeliers and tables dressed in white linen, a young woman named Amara Okoye carried herself like a shadow, unseen, though she moved through brilliance. It was supposed to be just another shift, another evening of balancing trays heavy with champagne flutes, smiling politely at guests who never saw her, whispering "yes ma'am" and "right away sir," while her mind lingered on the unpaid hospital bill folded in her pocket, the one that spelled her mother's dialysis and her family's hope in red ink she could not erase. Yet fate rarely announces itself with trumpets. It often comes as a whisper, a slip of paper, a moment so small it feels like nothing until it changes everything. Amara had risen before dawn that morning, her body already sore from 2 jobs, but she told herself she could endure one more shift, one more night of bending without breaking. On the crowded Dunfo bus to the island, her phone buzzed with reminders she ignored, her eyes fixed instead on the horizon where skyscrapers rose like indifferent gods. By 7 o'clock, she was in uniform, crisp white shirt tucked into a skirt hemmed and re-hemmed until the fabric thinned like old faith, apron tied tightly as if it could hold together both her dignity and despair. She thought she could glide through the evening unnoticed, another anonymous figure in black shoes polished to a dull shine. But life does not always let the desperate stay invisible. At 7:45, as she moved through the side corridor balancing 3 plates of peppered prawns, a man in a dove-gray suit brushed past, sliding a card into her palm so swiftly it felt like sleight of hand, his breath carrying the sharp scent of imported whiskey, and words that lodged like hooks in her chest. "Text me if you want to earn real money tonight." He was gone before she could even protest, leaving only the rectangle of glossy cardstock sweating in her trembling hand. She told herself to throw it away, to stay clean, to swallow the hunger of debt like she had every other day. But when she ducked into the staff washroom and finally looked, the words stared back at her. TJ, problems solved. She should have laughed, should have ripped it up, but instead her thumb found her phone and typed the number, her heart galloping as though each digit was a sin. "Who are you?" she asked, barely breathing. The reply came quick, slick, too fast. "Someone who can help you clear a hospital bill and still get you home before midnight." Her knees weakened, her throat dried. For a moment she thought of her mother's tired eyes, of the clinic nurse who no longer smiled when Amara promised to bring money tomorrow. For a moment she thought of all the times she had watched wealthy men toast with bottles that could have paid a month's rent, while she counted coins to buy a cara on her way home. She typed again, "How?" 10 minutes later, she was outside, the lagoon wind tugging at her sleeves, the night heavy with secrets. There, leaning against a black SUV that seemed carved from shadow, was TJ himself. Short beard trimmed neat, wrist heavy with a watch that could have paid her mother's entire treatment, smile sharp enough to cut. "Simple job," he said, showing her a photo on his phone. A man with kind eyes stood beside a charity banner,
Michael Adeyemi, the billionaire philanthropist everyone in Lagos whispered about, a man whose fortune built tech empires and whose face appeared in magazines Amara had once flipped through in hair salons. He's meeting someone here tonight. You just have to ruin it. A spill, a broken plate, a small scene. Nothing that scars, only stains. His words slipped into her ear like oil. She frowned, whispered, "Why?" And he only shrugged. Lagos is a chessboard. Someone wants a move blocked. Then he mentioned the money, half up front, half later, and her breath caught as if the figures themselves were chains. In his hand, a small vial glimmered like liquid mischief. Drop this in her drink, not poison, harmless, just turns liquid into slime. She'll storm out, he'll be embarrassed, and you walk away richer. Amara stared at it, her hand refusing to rise. If anyone gets hurt, she began, but TJ cut her off with a smile that looked too much like victory. No one will. You're good at your job. Make it look clumsy. In the distance, the lagoon lights blinked like patient eyes, as though the water itself was waiting to see her choice. She felt the envelope of cash slide into her apron pocket, heavy as guilt, warm as temptation. And in that moment, she knew her night would not end in silence. What she didn't know was that this choice, the quiet, desperate yes she did not even speak aloud, would open the door to a story larger than bills and betrayal, a story where truth would not stay hidden, and where love, real and dangerous, waited just beyond the edge of her obedience.
When Amara returned inside the restaurant, the envelope pressed against her waist like a living thing, her palms damp as though the cash itself burned her skin, and every step she took seemed louder, as if the marble floors and the glittering chandeliers knew she was carrying a secret no apron could hide. The dining hall was alive with the hushed laughter of Lagos elite, perfumes warring in the air, silver cutlery flashing like polished teeth. But Amara felt only the pulse in her ears as she slipped back behind the counter, her eyes darting toward the bar, where the night storm was already brewing. Table 12 had been reserved for weeks, a prime corner with a sweeping view of the lagoon, and there sat Tasha Alade, perfect in velvet red, her nails like sharpened glass, her phone glowing with 1,000 followers waiting for her next post. And across from her, just arriving, was Michael Adeyemi himself, tall, broad-shouldered, every movement unhurried, his smile cutting through the glitter not like power, but like calm, a man who did not need to demand a room's attention because the room gave it anyway. The sight of him made Amara hesitate. He looked different from the frozen magazine photos, softer, realer, the type of man who shook the waiter's hand before sitting, who actually looked into eyes instead of past them. Her fingers brushed the vial in her pocket, the instructions echoing in her mind. Just a pinch, nothing more. She storms out, and you walk away rich. But her stomach twisted, not just with fear, but with something sharper, a question she couldn't shake. If this man was kind, if he was generous, what right did she have to plant shame at his table? Mrs. Eno's voice broke her thoughts like glass, hissing through gritted teeth as she pressed a tray of cocktails into Amara's hands. Hurry, don't hover. VIPs don't wait for girls who daydream. She moved toward the table, her step steady though her heart staggered. And when she arrived, Michael looked up, his gaze catching her name tag, and he said it aloud. "Thank you, Amara," in a tone that carried no mockery, no dismissal, just simple acknowledgement. And the sound of her name spoken like that almost undid her. She placed the drinks carefully, the vial poised between two fingers, and for a breath she thought of her mother's face, gray with illness, whispering, "Don't worry, God will provide," while bills piled higher than hope. And that memory tightened her grip, forced her to tilt the vial just enough so the powder slid into the martini meant for Tasha. It dissolved instantly, invisible, a secret swimming in sweetness. Amara, forced to smile, turned to leave, but the world conspired against her, because at that moment, a small boy in a miniature suit from the next table broke free from his nanny's hand and stumbled into her leg, the tray lurching, champagne tumbling in a golden arc across Tasha's lap. Gasps erupted like sparks. Tasha leapt to her feet with a shriek, and Amara's apology flooded the air. But before her manager could reach them, Michael was already standing, pulling out his handkerchief, his voice calm as he said, "Accidents happen. Please don't be harsh." His kindness again struck her like an arrow. She should have bowed, should have scurried away, but her eyes met his for a fraction longer than service etiquette allowed, and something in that look told her he saw more than a clumsy waitress. Tasha dabbed angrily at her dress, muttering about incompetence, and then, determined to reclaim control of the evening, she grabbed her martini, sipped, and immediately recoiled in horror as the liquid stretched thick and viscous between her lips and the rim like some nightmare dessert. A murmur rippled across the hall, phones tilted upward, fingers ready to capture a scandal. Tasha spat into her napkin, disgust scrawled across her face. "What is this?" she snapped, slamming the glass down, while Amara stood frozen, shame crashing over her in waves. Michael frowned, lifted the glass, swirled it, then turned slowly to Amara not with anger, but with quiet demand, the kind of look that asked for the truth and nothing less. Her lips trembled, and in that moment she knew she could lie, could let the restaurant swallow the blame, could walk away with her pocket full of answers for her mother's survival. But she also knew his eyes was steady and waiting, and so the confession broke out of her chest like a bird too long caged. "It was me." The room gasped, forks clattered, Mrs. Eno hissed her name, but Amara stood her ground, voice trembling but clear as she said, "I altered the drink. I was paid to ruin this evening, and I can't carry it anymore." She pulled the brown envelope from her apron and placed it on the table, the weight of every bill, every mistake, every desperate compromise thudding against polished wood, and the silence that followed was heavier than judgment. It was the silence of lives about to change.
The lounge behind the main dining room had never felt so tense. Its velvet couches and dim lamps meant for comfort, now framing a scene that trembled with consequence. For Amara sat on the edge of her seat, apron strings loose, eyes heavy with the weight of her own confession, while across from her, Michael Adeyemi leaned forward with the calm intensity of a man accustomed to storms, yet unwilling to let this one pass without clarity. Beside him, Tasha Alade fumed, her designer dress blotched with champagne, her pride dripping thicker than the ruined cocktail she had nearly swallowed. And in the corner stood Mrs. Eno, arms folded, mouth pursed like the jaws of a trap waiting to snap shut. "Start again," Michael said quietly, not with the impatience of a man embarrassed in public, but with the patience of someone who believed truth was more useful than punishment. And though Amara's throat burned with shame, she obeyed, her voice steadying as she described the alley, the man in the gray suit, the heavy envelope, the tiny vial of powder that turned liquid into disgrace. She confessed to everything, even her mother's failing health and the desperation that had made her hands tremble against her conscience. And when she finished, the room pulsed with silence, broken only by the faint hum of Lagos traffic outside. Tasha's laugh sliced through the quiet, brittle and cruel. "So I was the target of some cheap fixer's trick? How typical, how Lagos, jealous men, desperate girls, and me caught in the middle." She glared at Amara, but Michael's gaze never wavered from the waitress, and in that gaze, Amara saw something she did not expect: understanding. "You should have told me no," he said softly, "but you told me the truth instead, and that is rarer than gold in this city." He reached for the envelope, opened it, and the sight of crumpled notes made him sigh, not with scorn,
but with recognition, as though he too had once known nights where survival felt like theft. "Who paid you?" he asked, his voice low but edged with steel. Amara hesitated, and in that pause, her eyes flickered to Tasha's phone lying carelessly on the table, a recent notification glowing across the screen. "B, we're set." Her heart thudded. The initial was enough, the implication dangerous. She shook her head. "I don't know his full name, only his initials. TJ said Lagos is a chessboard, and I was just a pawn." Michael's jaw tightened. "Then let's find out who's moving the pieces." He rose, tall and commanding, and when he turned to Mrs. Eno, who looked ready to tear Amara apart, he simply said, "She stays." The floor manager blinked. "Sir." "She stays," he repeated, his voice final, and in that moment, Amara realized she was not fired, not erased, but suspended in some strange mercy she did not feel she deserved. Tasha stood abruptly, smoothing her dress, her fury brittle as glass. "Do whatever you like, but I refuse to be part of this circus," she snapped, storming toward the door, her heels clicking sharp as gunfire against the tiles. Michael did not stop her. Instead, he sat back down, folding his hands, studying Amara as though she were a puzzle piece fallen into the wrong box. "You know what you risked by telling me this," he said. Amara swallowed hard. "Yes, my job, my dignity." "And still you told the truth," he murmured, almost to himself. For a moment she wondered if this was the twist TJ had spoken of, the invisible war she had stumbled into. But then Michael's phone buzzed, and with a swipe, the lines of his mouth grew grim. "Temitope Jimo," he said aloud, "ex-security contractor, now selling solutions like poison, and the one who contacted him, Bola." The name made Tasha freeze in the doorway, her body stiff as a statue. "My ex-manager," she whispered, her voice brittle. "He couldn't stand that I left him behind. He always said he'd remind me who made me." Michael nodded slowly, pieces aligning. "So he chose to humiliate you in public. Coward's tactic." He turned back to Amara, his expression softer now. "And you unknowingly were caught in his plan, but you broke it by telling the truth. That means the game just changed." In that dim lounge, with the city's lights flickering against the lagoon outside, Amara realized her night was no longer about survival. It was about secrets unraveling, about the collision of power and vulnerability. And in that collision, she felt herself drawn not to fear, but to the strange steadiness in Michael's gaze. She had ruined his date, confessed her betrayal, and yet instead of casting her aside, he had made a choice that shocked her. He had kept her at the table, as though her voice mattered. That was the beginning of a shift she could not yet name, a twist not planted by TJ or Bola, but by fate itself. A twist that would turn a poor waitress into something no one in that glittering restaurant could have predicted.
The next morning, Lagos woke hungry for scandal, and the city did what it always did: chewed whispers into headlines, spit gossip across Instagram, turned fragments of truth into glittering lies, so that by sunrise, blogs screamed, "Influencer humiliated in slimy drink," and "Waitress exposes secret plot at La Paloma," while photos blurred across timelines showing Tasha Alade's shocked face frozen mid-scream, and Michael Adeyemi standing behind her like a shield. Yet in the staff quarters, Amara sat hunched on a wooden bench, apron balled in her hands, certain that every ring of her phone was another summons to disgrace, another door slamming on her chance to save her mother. She imagined Mrs. Eno's fury, the owner's wrath, the weight of police questions she could never answer. But when the call finally came, it was not a termination. It was a summons from Michael himself. Confused, trembling, she arrived at the small office where he waited, not flanked by lawyers or bodyguards, but alone, sleeves rolled, the air heavy not with anger, but with a strange quiet. "Sit," he said. And though her instinct was to stand, to shrink, she obeyed, her knees brushing the edge of the desk. He slid a paper across to her. A receipt stamped "Paid" in red ink, St. Catherine's Clinic letterhead stark against the page. "Your mother's treatment," he said simply. Amara's throat closed. "Why?" she whispered. "Because you told the truth when you could have lied," he replied. "And because no mother should pay for her child's desperation." But the kindness she longed for twisted into dread, for kindness was costly in Lagos, and already she felt the invisible eyes of those who would never forgive her for catching it. By evening, the threats began, not from Michael, not from La Paloma, but from the shadows. Anonymous numbers flashing warnings. A note slipped into her locker with only 2 words: "Stay silent." She didn't need to ask who sent it. Bola's name carried the stench of men who believed themselves untouchable, men who hired fixers like TJ to dirty their hands while theirs remained perfumed. She wanted to run, to disappear into the city's belly, but Michael refused to let her. "They are counting on your fear," he told her, as they sat at a quiet suya stand, the smoke curling like omens into the night sky. "But fear is the only power they have." She looked at him then, the billionaire everyone whispered about, and saw not the magazine smile, but the fatigue of a man who had learned that power invited predators. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, suspicion cutting through gratitude. He looked at her with eyes steady as tide. "Because you remind me of who I used to be, hungry, desperate, one wrong choice away from ruin, and because I can." Yet disaster has a way of multiplying, and even as his words wrapped around her like safety, the city sharpened its claws. La Paloma received anonymous complaints demanding Amara's dismissal. The clinic was flooded with calls claiming the payment was fraudulent. Even her landlord muttered that a young woman with sudden benefactors could not be trusted. Shame began to stalk her in the marketplace, in the church pews, in the suspicious glances of neighbors who whispered that she had sold herself for money. Her mother, too ill to know the details, clutched Amara's hand and whispered, "Don't let them break you, my child." But every whisper of judgment felt like a nail hammered into her resolve. And then came the cruelest blow. Photographs leaked online, not of Michael, not of Tasha, but of Amara herself, snapped as she left the restaurant, her face grainy yet clear enough to show, captions branding her the waitress who ruined a queen's night. Trolls swarmed, hurling insults, calling her greedy, shameless, a pawn unworthy of the mercy she'd received. Alone in her room that night, she pressed her palms to her face, tears finally breaking through, not for the lies told about her, but for the unbearable truth that her attempt to save her mother had instead painted her as villain in a story she never asked to join. And still, in the silence, her phone buzzed once more, a message from Michael. "Do not give up. This is not the end of your story." She stared at it until dawn, unsure if his words were a promise or a warning, but certain of one thing: disaster had only just begun, and the next move would demand a courage she wasn't sure she possessed.
By the time a week had passed, Amara felt as though the whole city had turned its eyes on her, not with compassion, but with suspicion, because gossip in Lagos was not smoke, but wildfire, burning faster than truth could run. And though Michael's statement had calmed some of the press, the blogs continued their feast, whispering that the billionaire had fallen for a waitress and that she had played him like a violin. Rumors she tried to ignore until she saw her photo splashed on a gossip site beside headlines that sneered at her dignity. But while the world mocked, Michael moved with quiet precision, because behind the noise of paparazzi and hashtags, he had set his team to work. And one evening he arrived at La Paloma not as a guest, but as a storm, his presence filling the foyer until even Mrs. Eno forgot her scowl. "Temitope Jamo has been detained," he said simply, and though he spoke softly, every staff member within earshot froze, for the fixer, whose name was whispered in alleys, had suddenly been dragged into light. Amara felt relief, but also terror, for if TJ had fallen, the man who hired him would not sit idle. Her fear proved true that night when, as she walked home along the dim streets of Ajagunle, a car rolled up beside her, tinted glass sliding down to reveal Bola himself, his grin sharp, his eyes glittering with menace. "Little waitress," he said, his voice oily, "you think truth will save you? You think Adeyemi's protection is forever? Remember this, everyone who crosses me pays." She clutched her bag and ran, the laughter chasing her down the street like a curse. By the time she reached her door, she was shaking, and when her phone buzzed with Michael's name, she answered in tears. "He found me," she whispered. There was silence on the other end, then Michael's voice, low and steady. "Then we end this tonight." She didn't know what he meant, but an hour later she was seated in a quiet conference room high above Victoria Island, the lagoon shimmering below like black glass, as Michael laid out the truth. Bola had been siphoning money through fake contracts, using Tasha's name and image as leverage, and her public humiliation had been his warning shot. "He doesn't just want to control her," Michael said, his gaze steady. "He wants to control everyone who thinks they can walk away." Amara's breath caught as the realization hit. Her small act of confession had not just exposed the date, but cracked open a web of corruption too big for her to comprehend. "Why me?" she whispered, and Michael answered, "Because you were the only one honest enough to speak when silence was safer." At that moment, the door opened, and Tasha herself stepped in. No cameras, no followers, just a woman whose pride had been scraped raw. She looked at Amara not with fury, but with something softer, almost ashamed. "I didn't believe him at first," she said quietly. "I thought you were just some jealous girl. But then I saw the messages on my own phone. Bola's setting me up. You saved me from worse than embarrassment." For a moment, the three of them stood together, an influencer, a billionaire, and a waitress, united not by class or wealth, but by betrayal that had cut through each of them differently. Yet the twist was not mercy, but choice. For Michael turned to Amara then, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that could not be undone. "You can walk away now, disappear back into your life, and no one will fault you. Or you can stand with us, help us expose him fully, and know that nothing will be the same again." The air in the room tightened, the hum of Lagos beyond the glass suddenly distant, as though the city itself leaned in to hear her answer. Amara thought of her mother asleep in a clinic bed, of the neighbors who whispered she was cursed, and of Bola's laughter slithering down Ajagunle's streets, and she felt the fear curl inside her like smoke. But beneath it, she also felt something fiercer, the ember of dignity she had nearly traded for a quick envelope. And with a breath that tasted like defiance, she said, "I'll stand." Michael's gaze softened, Tasha exhaled, and in that instant, the game shifted from survival to battle, the kind of battle that could ruin them all or free them forever. And Amara, the poor waitress paid to ruin a date, stepped unknowingly into the center of a war that would decide far more than one night at La Paloma.
The weeks that followed felt like walking across fire. Every step a test of courage, and every shadow a reminder that Bola's reach was long. But once Amara had spoken her choice aloud, "I'll stand," there was no turning back. And she found herself drawn into a world she had only seen from the edges of gossip headlines, sitting in conference rooms with lawyers who spoke in careful codes, standing beside Michael at quiet briefings where his foundation's board debated risk and reputation, listening as investigators unwrapped years of forged invoices and blackmail trails that wound back to Bola like poisonous roots. Yet through it all, she remained steady, though she never forgot who she was, a waitress from Ajagunle who had once thought a vial of powder could buy her mother's life. Bola fought back with fury, releasing doctored videos online painting Amara as a gold digger, twisting the narrative until strangers spat her name with contempt. But every time she faltered, Michael's voice anchored her. Truth is slower than lies, but it lasts longer. And slowly, painfully, the tide began to turn. Tasha broke her silence, going live not with filters or brand deals, but raw and trembling, telling millions that she had been manipulated by a man who tried to own her image and punish her independence. And in that moment, the world that had mocked Amara saw her differently. Not as villain, but as witness. The girl who had pulled back the curtain when it was easier to keep it closed. Bola was cornered at last, his empire of clubs and bribes crumbling under evidence too thick to drown, his swagger collapsing into silence as police finally placed handcuffs on wrists once decorated with gold. The day of his arrest, Amara stood outside the courthouse, the air thick with heat and cameras, and though flashes burned her eyes, she lifted her chin, not because she wanted fame, but because she wanted the world to know that the poor girl they tried to use had not broken. Her mother's health improved steadily, each treatment a quiet victory, paid not by stolen envelopes, but by clean receipts bearing Michael's foundation's seal. And the whispers in her neighborhood never fully died. She learned to walk through them with the calm of someone who had faced worse storms. At La Paloma, the staff who once avoided her now nodded respectfully, some even apologizing in small, awkward ways. And Mrs. Eno, though never soft, began assigning her the VIP tables, muttering, "If you can survive that scandal, you can handle anything." But the greatest change came not from courts or clinics, but from the rhythm that grew quietly between her and Michael, unannounced, unforced, a companionship that did not start with flowers or flashy dinners, but with shared silences, late-night calls where he asked about her day, visits where he listened more than he spoke, evenings where they walked the lagoon's edge eating corn core like ordinary Lagosians. She fought the doubts, whispers that he pitied her, fears that she was too small for his world, but his actions answered louder than her insecurities. He treated her not as a charity, but as an equal, the one voice who had dared to cut through lies when he, with all his billions, might have remained blind. One evening, months later, as the sun melted into the lagoon and the restaurant's windows glowed gold, he looked at her across a quiet table and said simply, "You changed everything." And for the first time in years, she believed it, not as flattery, not as rescue, but as truth. Her journey had begun with shame, betrayal, and a choice that nearly crushed her, but it ended with strength, dignity, and the proof that even those born into struggle could stand at the center of storms and not drown. And when she stood once more in front of the mirror, apron tied, hair neatly pinned, she saw not the poor waitress who had been paid to ruin a date, but the woman who had found her voice, her courage, and, unexpectedly, love that asked for nothing but honesty. And so the story closed not in tragedy or mystery, but in redemption. Because sometimes the worst choices lead us to the best truths, and sometimes, when the world thinks you are a pawn, life crowns you queen.
Months turned into a year, and though the noise of scandal eventually quieted, the echoes of it shaped Amara's life in ways she had never expected. For while Bola's trial unfolded in stiff courtrooms, and his name became a cautionary whisper in Lagos nightlife, Amara's own name began to carry a weight she never asked for. Whispered first in the kitchen of La Paloma, where junior waitresses looked at her with a mixture of awe and relief. Then in church pews, where mothers pointed her out to daughters with soft admiration. And finally, in the glossy pages of magazines that labeled her the woman who told the truth when lies would have been easier. But beyond the titles and stories, Amara lived simply.
moving her mother into a modest apartment away from the damp walls of Ajegunle, spending mornings at the clinic, afternoons balancing trays, and evenings with a set of second-hand culinary books spread across her small table, because Michael, with his quiet insistence, had enrolled her in a scholarship program through his foundation that trained young women in professional cooking. She doubted herself at first, convinced she didn't belong among polished chefs with accents that rolled like butter. But each knife she sharpened and each sauce she mastered stitched back a piece of the self-respect she had once nearly traded for a quick envelope. And through it all, Michael remained constant, not as a savior hovering above her, but as a presence at her side. The man who appeared at the restaurant not in suits that screamed power, but in simple shirts, ordering jollof and suya like any other guest, leaving tips folded quietly beneath napkins, never demanding her time, but always giving her space to choose him. Their bond grew not with fireworks, but with steady flames, long drives to Lekki Beach where they ate akara by the roadside, nights where he asked about her fears and listened without interruption, mornings when she found herself sketching his profile into the margins of her recipe notes, as though her hand had learned to confess before her heart did. The city noticed too. Blogs still muttered the billionaire and the waitress, but even the cruelest voices could not deny the evidence. She had not chased him, had not flaunted him, had not used his name to climb. She walked beside him, not behind, and that truth unsettled those who believed class and wealth were iron bars that never bent. Her mother, regaining strength, teased her gently. "This man looks at you like you're his sunrise," and Amara would blush, denying, yet in her heart she knew it was true. One evening, on her way home, she passed the old alley where TJ had handed her the card that changed her fate, and for the first time she did not feel fear or shame, only gratitude for the crossroads that had forced her to choose between silence and truth. She remembered the trembling girl who had almost destroyed herself for quick cash, and she whispered to the night, "I forgive you." Not to TJ, not to Bola, but to her younger self. By the time her culinary program ended, she had earned not just certification, but confidence. And when Michael invited her to cater a quiet board dinner for his foundation, she nearly refused, afraid of whispers, but she accepted. And by the end of the night, as guests praised the dishes and investors murmured about funding a small kitchen venture in her name, she realized her life had pivoted again, not by scandal, not by survival, but by her own hands. Standing in the glow of that night, apron smeared with sauce, hair curling loose from heat, she caught Michael's gaze across the room and saw not pity, not charity, but pride so deep it left her breathless. In that moment she knew that her story was no longer about being the poor waitress who had been paid to ruin a date, but about becoming the woman who had chosen truth, endured disaster, embraced redemption, and discovered that love, the kind that grows steady, patient, unshaken, can be found even in the most unlikely of places.
By the time another year passed, the story that had begun with a vial of powder and an envelope of cash had transformed into something even Amara could scarcely believe. For on the evening of her 27th birthday, she stood not in the dim staff room of La Paloma, but in the heart of her own restaurant, the Lantern House, a modest but beautiful space on the edge of the lagoon, where lanterns hung from the ceiling like captured stars, and the scent of suya spices mingled with the warm laughter of customers who had come not for gossip, but for food that spoke of resilience, dignity, and hope. She wore no apron that night, only a simple navy dress, her mother seated proudly in the front row, Michael beside her, watching as a journalist asked how a poor waitress had risen to become the owner of one of Lagos's most talked-about culinary spaces.
And Amara, steady now in voice and gaze, said softly, "Because sometimes you were asked to ruin someone else's story, but if you hold on to truth, you end up rewriting your own." The crowd applauded, but behind her words was a private truth known only to those who had walked beside her. The truth that redemption is not a gift but a choice, one she had made trembling, afraid but determined. The city still remembered Bola, now reduced to a cautionary headline, his name a synonym for greed and ruin. But Amara no longer flinched when it was spoken. Instead, she remembered how his threats had once seemed larger than life, and now he was nothing more than a footnote in a story about her survival. Tasha, too, had rebuilt herself, her empire born not from curated filters, but from honesty. And though they were not friends, there was a respect that bound them, a nod across crowded rooms that said, "We survived him." And as for Michael, he remained at her side, not as a patron or protector, but as a partner in the truest sense. He helped sweep floors when customers left, wash plates when staff fell behind, laughed with her mother over bowls of pepper soup, and once, on a quiet evening after the last guest had gone, he pulled her into his arms and said, "You ruined my date that night, but you saved my life." And she smiled, resting her head against his chest, whispering back, "Maybe we saved each other." It was not the fairy tale ending people might imagined, not champagne towers or diamond rings paraded before cameras, but something quieter, deeper, and stronger. A love built on truth, a business built on hard work, and a life rebuilt from ashes. And as lantern light flickered against her face, Amara thought of the night she almost drowned in shame, the night she nearly sold her soul for survival, and she felt no regret, only gratitude that she had chosen the harder road, the one that carried her here. Because in the end, the poor waitress who was paid to ruin a date had become the woman who found love, dignity, and freedom, proving to everyone and to herself that no amount of money or power can silence truth forever. And so her story closes not with defeat, but with triumph, and with a lesson clear enough for anyone listening. When life tempts you to sell your integrity for survival, hold fast to honesty, because the truth you protect today may become the foundation of the life you deserve tomorrow. If you believe that love built on truth is stronger than lies dressed in gold, subscribe and share this story, and let Amara's journey remind you that even in the darkest corners of betrayal, light can still rise.